Okay, I think we are ready to go. We'll try and get the lights back on here. Somebody must have hit the wrong button or so.
I thought it was like in the opera.
Like in the opera where they do that to get your attention. Yeah, well, that'd be good. Okay, let's open with the word of prayer. Okay, let's pray. Gracious Father, we thank you so much for wonderfully blessing us again this week and just marvelously meeting our needs. We thank you for the way you've met the needs of KBC family members, varied levels of intensity with health issues and so on. But we thank you that you are Lord of all, that you are the great physician, and that you are able to do exceedingly abundantly above what we could even imagine. And so we thank you for that, and thank you that you are a great God. We thank you for setting apart this day from all others, so that not only individually but also corporately we could gather together and worship you. Thank you we live in this country where we still have this freedom, and we pray that through your gracious work we'd be able to continue to do it, but pray that you will give us a holy boldness to stand up for you and be counted, that we know that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. So help us indeed to be strong for righteousness and to point people to Jesus Christ, since we know that he is the answer to all of our problems. Thank you for your word as always. Help us as we seek to study some of these principles so we can be better interpreters, and so that every day as we read it in the comfort of our own homes, we will be able to enjoy our time and grasp more of it, we pray. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen. Okay, you should have a handout there, a two-pager. And today we are simply continuing. Remember, our current KBC series here in this adult class is on the hermeneutics, which is simply the study of the principles of interpretation. And hopefully by now, if you've been here at least more than once, you've been reminded, or you realize that this is not a peripheral subject. You know, sometimes we say, well, you know, let's just go to the Bible and open a book and we've got to study that, and if we don't, there's something, you know, we're not emphasizing the Bible. Well, no, actually what this class is all about is emphasizing the Bible, shall we say, more than we can imagine, because it is helping us so that in the privacy of our own homes, we can unlock the Bible for ourselves. The Bible is an open book. It is meant for the average human, maybe I shouldn't use that expression, average, what should I say here? It's meant for real human beings, okay, to be able to read it on their own. That was the whole battle of one of the whole battles of the Reformation. We don't need religious leaders to tell us what it means, and otherwise we just go home, put our Bible on the shelf to collect dust till the next Sunday. The Bible is meant to be read by the laity. And so as we talk about hermeneutics, we are saying that we want to be good interpreters. And remember, everybody, whether they're saved or unsaved, if they come to the Bible or if they're reading the Bible, they are reading the Bible through what we could call an interpretive grid, or they are reading it through certain eyeglasses. And that's why earlier on we talked about, as we're dealing with like different ways people interpret it, there are some people who come to the Bible and say, well, this is simply a human production. There's no way God could have written it, so there are errors here and all that. And so everything they read, when they read something they don't get, they just say, well, that's in error anyhow, or that was so-and-so's opinion, so I don't need to believe it. So everybody, from the most ungodly individual to the most godly individual, comes to the Bible with an interpretive grid. They have certain principles they're going to follow. And because this is the only book that God has written or ever will write, hopefully we would say, wow, I believe it is very important for me to have right principles of interpretation. It is important for me to know what God has revealed. I don't want to deceive myself, so I'm saying God said this, when in reality that's not what God meant in the Bible at all. That's not what he said at all. And so that's why we are studying such an important subject. So we've talked about, and I just put a couple of terms on the board as reminders. We've talked about things like key terms as we're dealing with this subject. We talked about the hermeneutical puzzle, as we said that there are really a lot of pieces in the puzzle that come together, such as geography and language and archaeology and culture and figures of speech, etc. And so the better we understand those individual things, the better off we're going to be. We've talked about building blocks. How we said that the Bible is indeed a human book. It was written by real human beings living in a real world in a real space and time context. but it's also a divine book because God was overseeing them. And that's why, on the one hand, when we read it like we're reading a book written by a novelist, if you will. But at the same time, we remember, wait a minute, there's no other book in the world that we'll ever read that ultimately has God as its author. And because God is ultimately the author, that means God has a right. It's a universal book, so God has a right to tell me what to believe and how to behave. The context for the last several weeks, Pastor Tommy was really driving home to us, context is king. We need to, we can't just, kind of say, Lord, I need a blessing today, open our Bible and, point our finger and say, oh, that verse isn't very blessed. Okay, God, I need a real encouraging verse today. So we flip over a few pages and then we just read that verse and kind of make it say what we want to say. And we say, whew, just had a great time in the Bible. Those 30 seconds will get me through the next 2 weeks. No, that's not how we read and study the Bible, okay? But context is king. And then, last week, Tommy really stressed the importance of taking the Bible literally. In other words, because this is a real book written by real people in real time, that means that we want to take it literally, just like when we're reading another novel, when we're reading a newspaper, when we're reading a magazine, etc. But now today, as you see at the top of your sheet, I want to make the case that we need to translate it figuratively. You say, wait a minute. Is he trying to sow discord among KBCers here? The pastoral team says interpret it this way, and ex-pastor Short says we're supposed to interpret it this way. Boy, we're going to have a good fight here. Well, does it have to be either or? So what do we mean when we're saying literally, as Tommy has talked about it, and now what are we meaning when we're talking about interpreting it figuratively? Okay? So, a couple of kind of introductory background things before we get more into the meat of them and the Bible illustrations. And that is, as you know from your own personal Bible reading, the Bible is full of images. The Bible is full of imagery, as well as a lot of figures of speech. And of course, that's because both of those things, images and figures of speech, are components of any language, whether the language is written or whether the language is spoken. Those are just some of the things that are common, whatever language we're talking about. And the reason for that is because books, the Bible, was written by real people in a real historical context, in a real time, and therefore we would expect that, and we should expect to find that in the Bible as well. Now, as we've been talking, one of the reasons why we need to really study principles of interpretation is because it can be difficult for us. And we've drawn like an illustration before, and we've said, let's just pretend that here was the world of the Bible. We'll just say the Bible world. And so we're going all the way back anywhere from 2000 to 3500. 2000 if it's the New Testament. With the Old Testament, we're going way back at least 3,500 years. And yet, right here, we are, as a modern, 21st century believer, and many times when we read it, we say, well, yeah, I can read what this says, but how do I bridge this gap? How do I get across that chasm, if you will, to understand exactly how that would apply to me today? Because otherwise, we have a tendency to maybe just read, especially the Old Testament accounts, and say, okay, that's neat historical information of what happened, but what in the world does the legal material have for me today? What in the world do the prophets have for me today, etc.? So part of, as we're talking about interpretation, we're saying, how can we bring this book from God over into our modern world without, shall we say, slaughtering it or sacrificing the meaning that God has for us in it? And of course, think of it. Even in modern day society, think of how many modern day expressions we have just in our own country that we might not even understand because of the Northeast, the South, the Southwest, the Far West, the radical left, California, whatever. Think of how many different expressions there are to say things that are just right now current, and they're in this one country that all supposedly speaks the same language. Okay? So at the bottom of your sheet, just to kind of get us off on a good mood here, if you will, go almost to the bottom where it says trivial dribbles. Okay? And I asked this question, what do you call the rolls of dust that collect on the floor under your bed? Dust bunnies, dust kitties, house moss, frog hair, woofin' poofs, or ghost manure? Well, you know what? Depending on where you live in the United States, that's what it's called. And it's called even more than that. I just gave you a representative sample. There's a real interesting 5-volume work called the Dictionary of, let me get it right here, the Dictionary of American Regional English. Actually, it was started back in 1962, and the 5th volume was finally published in 2012. Took them 50 years, and of course, it's about 10 years old, which means it's totally outdated, in one sense, if you will. But they simply talked to people all over the country and said, you know, what about this? How would you describe that? What's your term for that around here? And people would say, well, that's what we mean. You know, what do you mean by something else? And so the point I'm trying to make is, that just reminds us of the great gulf, if you will, at times that there can be for us as we try and understand a book that is so old. And down at the bottom, and this can maybe be some of your homework, what is the problem if a patient has dew poison? What does a waitress mean if she offers you coffee and snails? And it's not real snails either. What if someone directed you to the willy wags? What if something is skeevy? What does hella mean? Like, as in, that's hella cool. Okay? Well, those are, again, just some representative samples that if you're reading them and you're not from that part of the country where they use those terms, maybe, again, if context is king and you look at the whole context, you can say, oh, I think I understand what they're talking about. But otherwise, you might just take a wild stab and hope that you get it right. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about part of the perplexity of our subject matter. Now, let's go on your sheet then, drop to about the 3rd line where I give a definition for a figure of speech. A figure of speech is a word or phrase that is used to communicate something other than its literal, natural meaning. Okay? And let's drop down about 10 lines to where it says there figurative speech. Figurative speech is a picturesque, out-of-the-ordinary way of presenting literal facts that might otherwise be stated in a normal, plain, ordinary way. Thus, it is not antithetical to literal interpretation, it is a part of it. So perhaps we could think of terms like ordinary literal versus figurative literal. Okay? So, the point I'm trying to make here is simply, when we talk about interpreting something figuratively, we should not think of it as being the antithesis of interpreting it literally, but we should think of them actually as we might almost say sisters or close relatives, because a figure can only be interpreted if you understand the literal. Okay? So in other words, if I would say something like, Jack, we don't have any Jacks here, do we? I don't want somebody to say, he's getting on my case. Or maybe I should say Wilson here. Well, no, we'll just stay with Jack. Jack eats like a pig. Okay? We can say, okay, there's a comparison, and we're going to talk about this kind of figure of speech. But we immediately know what a pig is. So thoughts come to our mind, well, this is the way a pig eats. And so which one of those would be the point the writer's making concerning the way Jack eats? Now, if I would say that Jack eats like let's say a jabox, you would say, okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. You do? Okay. I see some of you quick scrambling there to get on Google and say, what is a jabox? If you find out, tell me, because I don't know. I just made it up, okay? But my point is, because we don't know what in the world this is, we're saying, are we talking volume? Are we talking a plant diet as opposed to a meat diet? Are we talking about, all kinds of stuff? And so therefore, Figurative only makes sense if there is something literal that you are familiar with. And that's why occasionally, we struggle with some of these ancient Near Eastern things because we don't know all that much about their ancient Near Eastern context. And so that's part of the reason why interpreters at times can really come up with seemingly diverse explanations, because they're struggling with what the Jabox is, if you will. So, really, if we're going to talk about the antithesis of literal, if here we have literal interpretation and you want the antithesis of it, it would really be, well, maybe you tell me. What would it really be? Because usually we think of literal interpretation, the opposite would be figurative. We said no. Figurative is actually a near sister here. So when we're thinking of Bible interpretation, and think of the way some people interpreted the Bible for hundreds of years, the major way it was interpreted, what's the opposite of literal interpretation? I think I heard the word allegory, right? Allegorical interpretation, or in allegories. And so when it was interpreted allegorically, basically you gave your mind just the freedom to kind of, come up with the weirdest things you could think of. There were no reins on it. So it was like, oh, okay, Jerusalem really stands for the church, and this really stands for that, and this really stands for the other thing. And wow, you can really get creative when you start just saying, well, that's how I interpret it. That's the way I see it. But that's not the way God meant it to be. So when we're talking about literal interpretation, it's including the figurative, because that's the way we just talk. That's just the way that we talk every day. Okay? So that's very important when we're thinking of figures of speech, and we're going to be getting to some examples in just a second. Now, second key thing here is, as we interpret like figures, etc., it has to do with images or imagery. So go back up just under the definition of a figure of speech that we read. Let's read this paragraph. Although the Bible was written at a distinct time and place, it is a universal book. A major aspect of the universality of the Bible is its use of recurring master images, or as technical writers would call it, archetypes. Thus, people of all different backgrounds and time periods can relate because the master images are from common, ordinary experience. Archetypes recur throughout literature because they are also pervasive in life. The archetypes of the Bible are one of the things that allow us to see our own experience in the Bible. The effectiveness of the image derives in part from its very familiarity. Okay? So, as you can see there, master images are in literature, secular literature. And of course, some of those they got from the Bible itself. And others maybe they simply use because they're common to ordinary life. Now, if you really want to do more studying or you want to go in more depth, maybe you can ask your spouse for a wedding anniversary gift to purchase for you the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. Okay? It's only, about 1,000 pages long, but it just deals with a lot of these images in the Bible, so that when you read a word and so on, you begin to realize, well, how else is that used in the Bible? How is that image traced through the Bible because it is so archetypal, or because it is such a major image? Okay? So, what are some examples that I gave you there on your sheet? Well, let's maybe quickly turn to these, even though all these passages are pretty familiar. But Psalm chapter 1, the chapter kicking off the book, sets the pace really for the whole book. And of course, we have blessed is the man, and then it gives us some negative characteristics of the man who is going to be blessed. And of course, automatically our mind should think, or probably thinks, aha, there must also be, and by man, of course, we're talking about human being, man and woman. That must mean that there are also people who are not blessed, who, shall we say, are cursed, if you will. And of course, sure enough, when we get down to verse 4, the ungodly are not like the man who is blessed. And then also, the blessed man does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, etc., but his delight is in the law of the Lord. But when we get to the ungodly man, he's going to be different. And then when we read this, we read these great nature illustrations. It talks about lushness. The man who is blessed of the Lord is a man who is, verse 3, will be like, here's a figure of speech, a tree planted by the rivers of water. So you can immediately think of a tree planted by water. It has a good water source and how it's prospering. And of course, think of this in the ancient Near Eastern context. It's really not hard to do living in Utah where it's so dry. Okay? Just think of how things dry up and die if you don't have water. And so here's the context of someone who indeed is, shall we say, drinking at God's spring. He's seeking to obey God. He's seeking to honor God. And even in a dry and barren place, if you will, he's prospering. He's bearing fruit. He's growing. He's maturing. And then it says the ungodly are not like that. They're like chaff. Well, coming from the Midwest, originally Ohio, you know what chaff is like when you're harvesting corn in the fall. Okay? You have these big corn pickers going through the field, and as they're doing it, some of the husks get knocked off the corn, etc., and start blowing in the field. And so as these winds are blowing across, hundreds of acres that are flat as a dime, chaff is very unsubstantial. It's the waste product. You don't have a farmer saying, oh no, somebody get something and grab the chaff. We need to put it in sacks so we'll have it this winter to feed the cattle. No, it's a waste product. And so what a picture this is here of the as I put on your sheet, of just two ways, two people, two destinations. And it says it all in 6 simple verses, and yet all these word pictures that come to mind, all these pictures that come to mind, all these thoughts that come to mind to describe. And then you begin to realize, wow, I know people like that. And maybe you think back of somebody you graduated from high school with, and you say, yeah, we were chums in high school. And wow, here we were, and I went this way, and now as I look back, they went that way. And I didn't think it was that big a deal that they made a few choices here. But look at the difference it has made 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road in their lives. 2 different people, 2 different paths, 2 different ultimate destinations. And maybe you immediately then think of Robert Frost's poem. A road, the road whatever, you know what we're talking about. Yeah, 2 paths diverged in the woods one day, etc., and, makes all the difference in the world. And right here in 6 verses, if you will, God has summed up really the totality of life, the whole thing. Because as you read the rest of the Bible, all those verses that talk about obeying God and loving God and serving God, etc., that's exactly what this individual has done, and so look what the end is going to be for that person. And all those warnings in the Bible. Don't think you're enough of a man or a woman, you can take this on yourself and do your own thing because you've got your way plotted and you know what's best for you and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, look what happens with that kind of a way. Wow. So simple and yet so profound. And it's because of the imagery. Or if we move over to like Psalm 23, very familiar with that. And so we have the Lord is my shepherd. So here we have this image of a shepherd. And of course that was a major image in the ancient Near East, not just in Israel, but even when we study like in Assyria, etc., the way they use the word shepherds, a shepherd for their leadership, etc. And I like to think of a psalm like this at multiple levels. On the one hand, I like to think of this as just David, David and his shepherding with real sheep. Because we have a lot of material in the Old Testament, in like Samuel, etc., that talks about some of his experiences as a shepherd. Okay? And so we say, well, what are the 3 basic things really that a shepherd is supposed to do? Well, basically, a shepherd is supposed to feed, a shepherd is supposed to lead, or we might say guide, and a shepherd is supposed to protect. And so we can see how David literally did that on the horizontal level just because he was a good, should we say, a good farm boy. But then we can think of it and say, where David then turns that around and he thinks of, shall we say, even David and simply his people. In other words, when he became the leader, how did he feed his people? How did he make sure they were hearing the Word of God? How did he lead them and guide them as a nation? How did he protect them from all the nations around them? And then you can take it to another level and you can say David thinks of this in relationship to his God. Just think of how he's thinking about it and he says, wow, just as this is what I was supposed to be doing literally to sheep and also as a leader to human beings, now think of how God has done that to me and how He is the ultimate shepherd who makes sure that I always have the proper food to eat. He ultimately leads me in the right path. He never happens to take me down some valley, some treacherous part of the valley, unless He did it for an intentional reason because He's trying to teach me lessons, but He's going to protect me all the while He's doing it, etc. And then, of course, when we read it, we can maybe simply say us, as we think of it, and the way God also directs in our lives. And we can say, wow, again, just 6 verses. But what a masterful image that is of God's great care. I mean, David could have simply written the verse and said, God cares for us. He watches over us and protects us, and He gives us the Bible to read, and all's going to end up in the end. And we read it and say, wow, I'm glad that was only 3 verses long. That cuts down on my Bible reading this week. No, hopefully not. But by reading this and having this image, our mind can go in a lot of directions. And we can think how, wow, what a shepherd God is for us, His sheep. And then if we want to turn over to Matthew 7, of course there are multiple indications in the Gospel simply because Jesus was the master, a master teacher when it came to images, when it came to imagery, getting the attention of the people and making His point. And so what do we have in Matthew chapter 7? Let's see. Let's pick up at verses 13 and 14. Enter ye in at the strait gate. Wide is the gate, broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. So what do we have here? We have 2 ways, 2 gates, 2 destinations. Again, just think of how simple this is stated. And it's all the way back again to our illustration of the 2 ways. You have to choose which way you're going to go in life. And while you're walking on that path, you're either going to be blessed of God or bad things are going to happen because God has told you this is what happens if you don't follow me, and they end up in 2 different places. And I mean, wow, this goes back, I don't want to get too far afield here because we could spend weeks on this, but this goes all the way back to like the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, where you have Dame Folly and Lady Wisdom. They're sexually charged images, if you will, but they're far beyond that. It simply is you have these 2 women, these 2 ladies, if you will, and they're standing right here at the fork in the road, and both of them are calling for young men who are passing by. So you have Dame Folly here who says, hey, young man, why don't you come my way? Just look what I have to offer. The man's not home. He took his suitcase. He said he'd be gone 3 weeks. And so I prepared a feast just for you, just the 2 of us. Nobody else will know it. And in those first 9 chapters, the writer just presents this kind of sensual appeal over and over as he's talking about this. But at the very same time, almost always after that, then we have Lady Wisdom, who also is standing here. And she's saying, young man, but you want to follow me because my way is a way of righteousness. what happens to you here is under the control of God because He cares for you more than you care for yourself, and it's going to end up in a good place. Where over here, the story always ends and it says, little does the person realize who follows this, that this is the path to hell. And again, supercharged image there. Well, Jesus, I'm almost certain, was thinking of that in the back of his mind as with his illustration here. There's simply two ways, two paths to follow, two gates. They have two completely different destinations. There's no fudging. The line has been drawn in the sand. Or as we continue in verses 15 to 20, you're familiar with this. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. Inwardly they are ravening wolves. Just think of the imagery that he brings up here. He could just say, beware of false teachers. They want to lead you astray instead of leading you aright. But he says, no, watch out because they're like a wolf. And immediately you think of, oh, what's a wolf like? What would it be like to have a Wolverine in my backyard or something? And then you say, wait a minute, in sheep's clothing, I thought a sheep, they're furry little pets that are fun to have around. What is he meaning here? And you begin to wrestle with that. And then he changes his image to, you shall know them by their fruits. And so he talks about growing things in the garden. And because we wanted to have some corn this past to eat at home this summer. We planted tomato plants because, naturally, if you plant a tomato plant, you're going to get corn. And we're disappointed because we're only getting tomatoes. We're not getting corn. You say, duh, have you lost your mind? Well, okay, maybe I have. But the point is, you plant what you want to reap. And Jesus is simply saying that here. You need to be careful what you plant because there's this law of sowing and reaping, this law of return. Okay? And so he uses a very familiar illustration in that particular culture. So you have false teachers, sheep, wolves, two kinds of fruit, two kinds of trees. Then he deals with house construction in verses 24 to 27. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rains descended, etc. Again, he's dealing with two types of people. And he's dealing with nature that they were familiar with because they had a dry season and a rainy season. And even if during the dry season you said, this will be a great place for me to build my house, if you were building it on a wadi, W-A-D-I, which really was a dry stream bed, the only time the wadi has water in it is during the rainy season when all of a sudden it becomes a gushing flood and just washes away everything. Kind of like people who build on the brink of a river. And then when the river floods every 3 years, the first thing they do is call their insurance man and say, does my insurance cover this? And Wilson says, no. That's not what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say, well, you're a nice guy, so of course. But yeah, and you just say, duh, why did they build there in the first place? Why were they allowed to build there in the first place? And so he's simply taking a very simple thing that everybody was aware of, and he's saying, duh, you just don't build your house in a wadi because you know it's going to get washed away. But if you build it in the right place, it doesn't matter what kind of floods come, etc. You've got it solidly built, firmly founded, and it can withstand all that kind of havoc, if you will. Okay? So these are, again, just some representative samples of the images. And I think sometimes, because especially if you were raised in a Christian home and from the time you were just a little tyke, you were reading the Bible and so on like that, sometimes it's real easy for us to just read past these in the sense that we are so familiar with them that it doesn't really jar us like it should. It really doesn't get hold of us like it should. And we say, wow, that is a powerful illustration in just 6 verses of all of life. And the importance of making right decisions and daily doing what's right, and then it's going to end up in a certain place. So those are the images. Now, because imagery and figures of speech have a lot of things in common, etc., kind of part of the same game, if you will, on your sheet I ask, well, why would God do this? Why would He use images and figures of speech so much, or what's the purpose? So again, just very simply, and really the 3 things I mentioned here are kind of overlapping. But first of all, it's just partially, I think, for beauty's sake. It's for beauty's sake. In other words, to add color, to attract attention, to aid in retention, to abbreviate an idea, to encourage reflection, etc. I mean, God could have written the Bible just in very simple declarative sentences. You know, God is good. God is holy. God is righteous. God is, I mean, just think of how small our Bible could be. Really make Bible reading easy, right? But He doesn't. He gives us a lot of stories and a lot of pictures and a lot of figures of speech to try and describe it. You know, it's kind of like maybe if we would say, or if I would say, you know, on Friday night it rained hard at my house. And it actually did for a little bit. It was amazing. Or I could say, wow, on Friday night it rained cats and dogs at my house. And probably then you would immediately think, whoa, you really got a lot. You know, at my house it was just spitting a little bit. But by just saying it rained hard at my house, it's like, okay, so what? Let's get on with it. And so just to add a little beauty, a little color. And by the way, that's a figure of speech. It rained cats and dogs because you probably didn't say, man, I'm glad I don't live in West Layton because that'd be bad news if, you know, after a storm you have to go out and pick up dead cats and dogs in your backyard. No, you didn't think that. That's just our way of saying that it was really raining. It was really raining hard. Okay, secondly, another purpose, to enhance the meaning by painting or imprinting a picture on the reader's mind. So, for example, think of the power of pictures. If some organization is trying to get you to make a donation to their organization, depending on where they're working in the world, what's probably one of the things you can guarantee is going to be on their flyer? Children?
Puppies.
Well, puppies if they're trying to get but what about children? Just children generally? Pardon? Big sad eyes, what else? Thin or bloated stomachs because they're trying to raise money for Africa. And so when you see that picture and you think of maybe your own children or grandchildren and you say, wow, that just grips me because just think some person's child looks like that and is almost going to die. There's just a resonance there. There's just a desire, well, okay, you know, I want to contribute a little bit. Or think of pictures of like when people were liberated from a World War II concentration camp. You probably have a couple of images in your mind because they're very classic pictures of what those people looked like when they were liberated. Or think of the destruction of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And especially that one picture, is it of a girl running out of Hiroshima? Looks like about a 14-year-old girl, maybe a young teen girl who is naked. Everything's just been blown off of her. And you have all this destruction in the background, and that just imprints on your mind a picture of the ultimate destruction. Well, such is the case of, shall we say, when God uses these various images and figures of speech. It's a way to imprint on our mind a picture, because there's some fluidity there. Okay, when you read it, it doesn't mean that you can always just exactly nail down everything that's specific about that particular figure. So for different people, it can have a little bit of a different meaning, and it's not like some are wrong and some are right. That's the way it is because of our backgrounds, etc., and the point is being made. And so God gives us these images, etc., for that. And then for the sake of effect, an effect here in the sense of writers talk about the difference between denotation and connotation. Denotation is basically objective. In other words, it doesn't evoke subjective feelings, but connotation has the idea of feelings, attitudes, and associations that gather around a word or image. And often an illustration that's used here is like the word home. Okay? The word home can be used denotatively just for, well, that's the place where I live, 3248 West, 200 North Layton. But if you're using it connotatively, a home becomes a place of security, a place of family friendships, of belonging, of peace, all kinds of stuff like that. And so when it is used in that particular way, then again, it just brings these images to mind. It brings these thoughts to mind that can really enlighten the passage or open up a passage for us. But as we're doing this, we also need some guidelines or cautions. So 3 pretty basic ones. First of all, we ask ourselves, what is the image, the referent, and the point of comparison? Okay? So, let's think of maybe these examples. Psalm 23 and verse 1. Okay, so when we're thinking of it, we have kind of our 3 categories here of the image, the referent, and the point of comparison. So let's say here's our image, here's our referent, and here's our point of comparison. So for example, in Psalm chapter 23 and verse 1, you have your image is that of a shepherd. And the referent here is the Lord. And so I put question marks here because you can fill it in. The question then becomes, what is the point of comparison between the Lord and a shepherd? What is the writer trying to make me think of? Okay, so we would say, well, a shepherd lives out in the middle of nowhere with his sheep. So it's probably saying the Lord lives out in the middle of nowhere. Well, no, wait a minute, that's probably not it. Well, let's see. A shepherd wears a long flowing robe and something white on his head to protect him from the sun. So I'll bet God, if I could meet him, would have on a long flowing robe. No, that doesn't sound right either. Okay? You see the point? It's important that we try to identify the legitimate points of comparison. As like I said before, I think probably at least the 3 key things we're supposed to be thinking of. Shepherds were supposed to feed their sheep, they were supposed to lead their sheep, and they were supposed to protect their sheep. And you see that really actually in the Bible as you keep reading the Bible and shepherding, especially when you get to Ezekiel 34, and he just really, God through Ezekiel really blasts the shepherds of Israel, the leaders of Israel. And the 3 key things he talks about is, you did not feed them, but you just made sure you always had the smorgasbord. You didn't lead them. In fact, when you did lead them, you led them down the wrong alley, and they were destroyed. And you didn't protect them because you didn't give a rip about them. All you cared about was saving your own hide. And so when we think of this, we say, yeah, this is pretty rich here when we think of how God does all these things for us, just like a shepherd who really cares for his sheep does all those things for his sheep. Or illustration number 2 on your sheet is Psalm 1:4. Chaff and ungodly, etc. We don't need to maybe turn there because we had just been there. So our image is chaff. The referent is the ungodly. And so our question is, how is an ungodly person like chaff? Blowing in the wind, probably the major thought is worthless, valueless, if you will. Okay? Song of Solomon 4:1. Maybe we need to turn there. That's not probably a verse you have memorized. And Song of Solomon has some really interesting images and figures of speech. So, here is the man talking to the woman. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove eyes within thy locks. Thy hair is as a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. And oh, she got all, teary-eyed over all that. You say, now wait a minute. What in the world could be going on here? Okay? So we have the flock of goats is our image. And the referent is her hair is like a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. So what in the world would be the point of comparison? And you're thinking of a flock of goats, and you say, a flock of goats, and you're saying, okay, let's see, goats, they're probably dirty from having been out all day, so he's saying, sweetie, you need to wash your hair, it's really dirty. That's probably not it. Or does it have to do with length? Maybe it was a long-haired goat, so he's saying, your hair is long. Or was it a short-haired goat? Your hair is short, and that's what makes it beautiful. Or is he talking about color? Or, what in the world is going on here? Well, that's part of what we need to struggle with when we think of the point of comparison. And, of course, we know he wasn't saying this tongue-in-cheek. This was a compliment, and she took it as a compliment. And so what about that culture back in that time? Well, what was there in that culture that would make this such a great way if you are going to refer to the lady that you love with those kinds of terms? And then another one I gave is in Revelation 3:5, where Jesus says, "Behold, I am coming as a thief." So we have thief here, and Jesus is coming as a thief. So what in the world is the point of comparison between Jesus and a thief? Well, you say a thief usually comes with a gun in hand, and so when Jesus returns, he's going to be fully loaded, and therefore, that's why I'm part of the NRA, and I believe you ought to stock your house with ammunition. And there's biblical proof for it. That's probably not the best Bible interpretation, okay? I'm not saying don't be part of the NRA or don't have guns, but that's not the biblical basis for it, if you want to say you need a biblical basis. But when you think of a thief, what's one thing about a thief that stands out? Surprise! Yeah, a thief doesn't generally come knocking on the door and say, "Hey, Royce, I just want you to know that tomorrow at 7 a.m. I am going to come and I'm going to steal one of the vehicles in your garage. So I just thought I would let you know, so if you hear the garage door going up, somebody's playing with your electric door." No, he's going to surprise you unexpected at a time you're not waiting on it. And so that makes a lot of sense here. Jesus, when you look in the context, etc., in other places, he's reminding people, don't think you have it figured out and I'll live like I want to, and then when I get ready, I will be ready for it because I know when he's coming. You don't know when he's coming. You don't know when you're going to meet him face to face. And that's why you always want to be ready. So, that's one of the guidelines. Number 2, we need to remember that images do not always mean the same thing. Okay? So you need to check the context. And that includes even elsewhere in the Bible if the image is used, as well as just the wider culture of the ancient Near East. So, for example, Hosea, who uses a lot of nature images. So we read there in chapter 6 and verse 4, Hosea says to the northern kingdom, "O Ephraim, what shall I do unto thee? O Judah, what shall I do unto thee? For your goodness," this is the word for covenant loyalty, that great Old Testament word that recurs like 22 times in Psalm 136. Okay? He says, "Your covenant loyalty is as a morning cloud, and as the early dew it goeth away." So Israel's covenant loyalty was like dew. What do you think that means? Disappears pretty quickly. Very, very short-lived. In other words, it's almost an oxymoron. Covenant loyalty means you're loyal through thick and thin no matter what. He says, no, your covenant loyalty is like the dew. It is here and it is gone. Very negative use. Now turn back to Hosea chapter 14 and verse 5. God speaking, and he says, "I will be as the dew unto Israel." Oh, okay. So God is going to be to them, he's going to be somebody who comes and just quick blesses them and then he's gone for a long time. No. What do you think he means here when he says, "I will be as the dew to you"? Pardon? Refreshing, yeah. You think of the importance of a dew, and even around here when days are hot, if you would have some pretty good heavy dews in the morning, that can really make a difference. And so here it's a very positive connotation to it. And so that's why as we read these images, we don't just lock our minds in and say, "Oh, well, this is what it meant here, so that's what it's got to be here," and go on. No, we say, wait a minute. Just look at how that one expression, that one thought, can actually be used in very, very opposite ways. And then C, the third reason that we have here is, or the third guideline or caution is to use common sense. Sometimes when you're reading parts of the Bible, your thought might be, Is this supposed to be taken literally, or is this actually a figure of speech? Or is this something that is figurative? And so as writers would say, ask yourself something like this. If I interpret it literally, would it be impossible? And if to interpret it literally would be something impossible, well, then probably the writer is telling you this is a figure of speech, or this is an image. You don't take it literally. If I took it literally, would it be absurd? Would it just sound worse than a joke, worse than just a science fiction something or other? Well, then probably it's meant to be taken in a figurative sense. Or would this be immoral? And if you'd say, well, yeah, if I took it literally, it would be very immoral. Well, then, in the light of what the Bible says in other places, it's evident this is just a figure where God is trying to make a key point. So, that's what we mean when we're talking about images and figures of speech. So this is all the introduction before we get now to figures of speech. 40-minute introduction. Questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions? Everybody on the same page? You see what we're talking about. Gary? The term flock of goats? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
That's why it was pleasing to the Lord.
Okay, Gary says that with a flock of goats coming down a hillside, looks like flowing hair as they're moving, and that's probably a good way to think of it. And probably we ought to also think of the Mount Gilead part, because that was an area where they were raising a lot of sheep, etc., like that. So a person would be very familiar with seeing sheep on the mountain there. Writers will often talk about the fact that I think the sheep that were raised in that area, we know, were of the variety with like a darker, or the goats were with like the darker coat. And so when it's like sunset and you have all these goats on the side of the mountain moving, and the sun is shining on their sleek hair, I mean, wow, it is just a beautiful picture, and could be, kind of reminded him of like her hair blowing in the breeze, if you will. So yeah, that's what we mean when we say, think about the point of comparison. And the more, this goes back to one of our initial topics, the more we know about like geography and various things of that sort, the more these kinds of images can be opened up to us, because then immediately we say, well, yeah, in that part of Palestine they raised sheep. In that part of Palestine they raised cattle, etc. It kind of reminds me, and I didn't include this as one of your one of the illustrations here, but in the book of Amos, where Amos, at the beginning of chapter 4, he says, "You cows of Bashan, the judgment of God is going to come upon you." And you say, really? Didn't the prophet have better things to do than to speak evil of animals? Well, actually, he's not talking about animals there. Who's he talking about? The women. And why would he say, "You women of Bashan"? Because he's talking about the women actually who don't live in Bashan. But why would he say, "You cows of Bashan"? What was Bashan known for? Where is Bashan if you opened a map and had to point your finger to a place? Don't remember. Dan, can you help us out here? No, you can't. Okay. Sorry I asked. Wilson, dare I call on you?
Can I make a wild guess?
Sure, wild guesses are always acceptable.
Well, it's probably not a good guess.
You've been over there, so...
Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah, it was a guess, all right. No, actually, it was east of the Jordan River. It was that good cattle-raising area where the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh said they wanted to inherit because it was so good for raising cattle. So the cows of Bashan were well known. It's almost today like if you get a thing in the mail and it says, don't you want to buy some Omaha beef? Now, if they would say, don't you want to buy some, what would be a good state that would be the exact opposite, like some New Hampshire beef, You'd probably say New Hampshire beef. Do they even have cows up there? I bet they're not very good. But certain parts of the country are well known for the choice fruit or vegetables or animals that they raise. And so when he called them cows of Bashan, he's saying, you're like a fattened cow, sleek. Wow, you think you got your act together, etc. You're the best of the best. But he says the wrath of God is going to come upon you, and as he goes on in the passage, he explains why. But he could have simply said, you women whose husbands have government positions, God's going to judge you. But he didn't. By calling them cows of Bashan, it just jumps out at you. And you say, wow. Can you imagine how offended can you imagine how fast they got on the phone and called their lawyers and said, somebody called me a cow of Bashan, we're going to clean them out, take them to court. And yeah, well, that's why God uses expressions like that, because it does really grab hold of us. Well, on the back, on page 2 of your handout, then, you have some figures of speech, and I think since we only have about 3 or 4 minutes to go, we're going to probably just stop here. This is a good stopping point. Can I trust you to bring this sheet back with you next time? And between now and next week, part of your homework will be, if you're really into figures of speech, to get E.W. Bullinger's book, Figures of Speech Used in the Bible. This is only 1,000 pages long, so that's only, about 130 pages a day to read. He lists 217 figures of speech used in the Bible. Okay? Has, I think some writer calculated, over 8,000 Bible references in here to illustrate the particular points. And it's about 1,000 pages long just in the text, and then it has a lot of indexes, etc. in the back. So the point I'm trying to make is the Bible is chock full of figures of speech. They're all over the place. And so the more we read them, the more we understand them, the more we think as we're reading about them, the better it will be for us to really grasp the teaching the Lord is giving us here. Okay, any concluding comments? Any final thoughts here? Okay, Lord bless you. Thanks for coming, and be sure to bring this back with you next week. We will finish it up.